It consisted through the First World War. We introduced conscription again in 1951. It fell into abeyance at the end of the 1950s and was reintroduced or reinvigorated under the Act in 1965 and provided bulk of service personnel for the Royal Australian Regiment in Vietnam.
And on our screen now we can see the Royal Australian Air Force veterans and current serving contingent. They're being led today by the 3-wing New South Wales Australian Air Force Cadet Band. And at the head of the RAF contingent is number 22 Squadron, City of Sydney Squadron. Established in 1936 out at RAF Base Richmond, it's where they continue to operate today, providing air base services. Just in front of that banner we can see Air Vice Marshal Darren Goldie, who recently took over the helm of Air Commander Australia up at RAF Base Glenbrook in the Balloon Mountains. Air Vice Marshal Goldie is a former C-130 E, H and J pilot with over 5,000 hours flying. Here we can see the 3-wing Australian Air Force Cadet Band again.
Yes, we skipped over 9 Div 6. Their banner march passed after the pipe band, so make sure the signals component for the Rats of Tobruk.
Number 22 Squadron that you can see there was established as a Citizens Air Force Squadron for reservist members in Sydney in 1936. So has held a very rich relationship with the Sydney area. In 1942 they received Boston bombers and were deployed north to fight the war in New Guinea, where they received the only Victoria Cross to be awarded to a RAF member in the South Pacific for Flight Lieutenant Bill Newton VC for his actions. After the war, the squadron returned to Australia and was based in a number of locations throughout Sydney. And in the last 10 years has taken on the role of providing airbase operational support at RAF Base Richmond. So they've been incredibly busy with supporting Operation COVID Assist, Flood Assist and Bushfire Assist in the wider Sydney and New South Wales area.
And just behind them we can see the banners of the Royal Australian Air Force Association and the Australian Flying Corps. During World War I, more than 3,000 Australians served overseas in 4 flying squadrons of the Australian Flying Corps, deploying to what is now modern-day Iraq, as well as the Western Front of Europe. This includes Lieutenant Frank McNamara, whose rescue of a fellow downed pilot in Mesopotamia earned him a Victoria Cross.
And he was definitely a lieutenant because he
Yes.
was Army at the time. And a nice link is that one of their members who returned to Australia, who'd flown with 3 Squadron, Nigel Love, helped start the Sydney Airport, which at the time was an eaten-out paddock and a broken-down abattoir. But he brought 3 Avro 504s back from the Western Front, and the next thing you know, he was looking for somewhere to land them, and AV Rose in England asked him for a paddock, and he found a spot down at Mascot.
It's worthwhile pointing out the banner too for the Women's Royal Australian Air Force Association, which is the first and largest of the 3 women's services during the war, with over 27,000 passing through its ranks.
And you just saw the Homebush Boys High School Drum Corps, which has been serving the Homebush and Strathfield communities for nearly 15 years. The boys are excellent school representatives and work hard at their craft. The Drum Corps traditionally performs at their local RSL and council events, as well as all formal school occasions. They've regularly participated in the Anzac Day events in the CBD.
At the bottom of our screen there we can see number 3 Squadron from RAF Base Williamtown. 3 Squadron's got a very rich history going back to the First World War with its service with the Australian Flying Corps. It was the first squadron to be based in Sydney when it was relocated to RAF Base Richmond in 1925, and also saw wartime service in North Africa and the Middle East.
And just behind them is 76 Squadron, another wartime Kitty Hawk squadron. 76 Squadron also fought in the Battle of Milne Bay in New Guinea in August and September, which saw aircraft attacking Japanese ground forces at the end of their airstrip. The attacks made by 75 and 76 Squadron were later described as the decisive factor in defeating the Japanese landing.
Behind them is 77 Squadron, also based up at RAF Base Williamtown, and also with a very rich history of wartime service, including Korea, where they were deployed from 1950 to 1953 in support of United Nations operations there. They started out the war with the Mustang before moving on to the Meteor jet fighter. Today they operate the F-35 Lightning at RAF Base Williamtown.
If Ray Seaver's watching, g'day Ray, and thank you very much for your assistance with the Korean War exhibition. He flew with 77 flying Meteors in 53 and earned the US Air Medal for the number of ops that he flew with 77.
Worthwhile pointing out RAF Ubon in Thailand. Many might not be aware that the RAF deployed a squadron of Sabre jet fighters to Ubon in Thailand to provide air defence of Thailand. Whilst not operationally deployed over into Vietnam, they were responsible for air defence and also conducted training against the United States Air Force Phantom squadrons that were also based at Ubon. Spitfire Association, I'll call out there. The Spitfires were operated by Australians early in the Second World War, but this year marks the 80th anniversary of their arrival in Australia as codename Capstan. They were initially based at RAF Base Richmond while the squadrons were formed up there before moving north to Darwin and Northern Australia to provide air defence against Japanese bomber raids.
Spitfires got the last Japanese kill over Australia in July 1944. They brought down a diner over Drysdale in the Kimberley.
Spitfire would have been very well suited for that job, being a fairly good performer up at high altitude, while the Kitty Hawk that the RAF also operated during the war were better suited for lower operations.
Tragedy at Spitfire was it had no legs. They didn't have the distance for Australia.
And just passing is the New South Wales Corrective Services Band, which was originally formed in 1981 to provide essential ceremonial support to Corrective Services New South Wales and the New South Wales Government. It's led by a full-time music director, Deputy Superintendent John Buckley, who was appointed to this role in January 2011.
Behind them is the 30 Beaufighter Squadron veteran members. I think in the wheelchair we can spot out Bruce Robertson from Castle Hill, who was a member of the squadron during the war. He was actually on radio at RAF Base Richmond during the midget submarine attacks in Sydney Harbour and overheard some of the traffic. 30 Squadron deployed its Beaufighters up to Port Moresby during the war in New Guinea, where they were put to devastating effect during the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. The Beaufighter was quick, had long range and heavy firepower, which meant it could do good work against the enemy at sea and on land. They were also operated as a long-range fighter throughout Northern Australia and across into the Southeast Asia.
Was it the Japanese that called them Whispering Death?
It's a bit of a myth, I think, that the Beaufighter community started about itself, but look, never let a good name go to waste. Behind them is the 22 Squadron Association, which also flew in many of the same battles as 30 Squadron, but initially with the American Boston bomber before they picked up Beaufighters later in the war as well. 454 and 459, which I believe were both formed at RAF Williamtown and sent to North Africa during the war, and then RAF Vietnam 1964 to 1972, this year marking the 50th anniversary of the return of number 35 Squadron.
I'm going to butt in because Bob Treloar is leading the RAAF in Vietnam. You can see retired Air Vice Marshal Bob Treloar, known as Trudy to his mates. He's just marched off, mentioned in dispatches. He flew the first Bushranger gunship into the Battle of Bin Bar, but was mentioned in dispatches for a very daring helicopter rescue during the war in Vietnam in 1969. The enemy closed to within 30 metres of his aircraft and were firing through his windscreen, but he picked up a few blokes from 5 RAR and got them out of there.
There we can see the 37 Squadron Association. 37 was formed in Melbourne in 1943, served throughout the war and post-war, and then disestablished until 1966. There's the current serving members from RAF Base Richmond, led by Wing Commander Anthony Kay, you can see there in the middle. 37 Squadron since 1966 has operated the C-130 Hercules at RAF Base Richmond, and arguably one of the busiest squadrons in the Air Force. Recently they've been engaged in Operation Tonga Assist, helping deliver relief out there, as well as the evacuation of non-combatants from Kabul last August. Following behind them are the RAAF Sunderland squadrons, which are 10 Squadron and 461 Squadron. First into combat, so they were deployed across to England to provide maritime patrol against German U-boats and other shipping throughout the war. 10 Squadron currently serving today at RAF Base Edinburgh in Adelaide with the Orion. I believe that's Air Mobility Training and Development Unit with number 3 Aeromedical Evacuation Squadron in front of them. AMTDU is responsible for developing airdrop loads to come out the back of our aircraft, as well as being carried underneath Army and Navy helicopters. There's been very busy developing new load carrying techniques with the introduction of new transport aircraft in the RAF over the last 15 years. Some of their handiwork has also seen Defence deliver resupplies to Antarctica to Australian research stations down there.
You're on, guys. Yeah, it is.
It's great to see young Australian cadets of all of Army and Air Force out there today.
Catalina Squadrons, the famous Black Cats. In fact, I think we might have heard one flying over Sydney earlier today. Catalinas had extremely long range and were very versatile in how they could be operated to provide reconnaissance against Japanese shipping, as well as attacks when required.
Indeed, we just had the medals awarded to Earl Waterhouse, twice mentioned in dispatches as a navigator in CATS, planting mines in Japanese ports during the war on those long-range operations.
And is that the Royal Air Force Association Sydney just behind? The Royal Air Force is the longest serving independent air force in the world, and the RAF Association Sydney branch represents all airmen and women who served in the Royal Air Force in the UK and all around the globe. Many Australians served in the Royal Air Force during the Second World War. During the early stages of the war, there were more Australians in the Royal Air Force squadrons than in the Australian squadrons.